Hello friends. My name is Nikhil, and today I'm going to tell you a story which will make you think. So let's start. In the spring of 1918, the city of New Orleans was alive with the sounds of jazz, bustling markets, and late-night celebrations. Beneath its vibrant atmosphere, however, a nightmare was about to unfold, one that would leave an entire city living in fear. Shortly after midnight on May 23, 1918, residents of a quiet neighborhood were awakened by horrifying screams coming from the home of Joseph and Catherine Maggio, an elderly Italian-American couple who owned a small grocery store. Neighbors rushed toward the house, expecting to find a robbery or domestic dispute. Instead, they walked into a scene of unimaginable brutality. Inside the bedroom, Joseph Maggio lay dead in a pool of blood. His throat had been slashed so deeply that it nearly severed his head. Nearby, Catherine Maggio was barely alive, suffering from severe head wounds caused by repeated blows from an axe. Despite desperate efforts by doctors, she died shortly afterward. The crime scene raised more questions than answers. The murder weapon was discovered inside the house, an axe that belonged to the victims themselves. Investigators found that a panel on the back door had been carefully removed, allowing the killer to enter unnoticed. Yet nothing of value had been taken. Money remained untouched, and there were no signs of a robbery. Police initially suspected a personal grudge or business rivalry. Detectives questioned relatives, neighbors, and former employees, searching for anyone who might have wanted the Maggios dead. Several suspects were detained, but no evidence linked them to the murders. As weeks passed, the investigation stalled, and fear began to spread throughout the city. Then, just as the public started believing the murders were an isolated incident, another attack occurred. On June 27, 1918, only a month later, Louis Bassumer and his mistress, Anna Lowe, were attacked while sleeping in their home. Like the Maggio murders, the assailant entered during the night and used an axe found on the property. Both victims suffered devastating head injuries, but miraculously survived. The similarities between the attacks were impossible to ignore. The killer struck under the cover of darkness, targeted sleeping victims, used axes found at the scene, and left without stealing anything. Detectives realized they were likely hunting the same individual, a predator who seemed to kill for reasons known only to himself. The attacks continued. On August 5th, another family became victims. Mrs. Schneider, a pregnant woman, was awakened by the sound of someone standing over her bed. Before she could react, the intruder struck her repeatedly with an axe. Miraculously, she survived and later described a dark figure fleeing the scene. Each new attack deepened the mystery. There appeared to be no connection between the victims. They lived in different neighborhoods, had different occupations, and came from different backgrounds. The killer selected his targets, seemingly at random. As newspapers reported every gruesome detail, panic swept through New Orleans. Citizens began buying firearms in record numbers. Hardware stores sold out of locks, bolts, and security equipment. Families stayed awake through the night, taking turns guarding their homes. Neighborhood watch groups patrolled the streets, carrying rifles and lanterns, determined to stop the killer before he struck again. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some believed the murderer was a deranged drifter. Others claimed he was part of a secret criminal organization. A few even whispered that he was something supernatural, a demon haunting the city. The police had no answers. The mysterious murderer became known by a chilling name that would soon be remembered across America: the Axeman of New Orleans. And the worst was yet to come.
By early 1919, the Axeman had become more than a murderer. He had become a legend. Months of bloody attacks had left New Orleans terrified. Families slept with loaded guns beside their beds. Businesses closed early. Every strange noise in the darkness sent people rushing to their windows in fear. Yet despite numerous investigations and countless suspects, the police remained helpless. The killer seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish without a trace. Then, on March 13, 1919, the city received a message that would transform the Axeman from a criminal into one of America's most bizarre mysteries. A letter arrived at the offices of local newspapers. Written in dramatic and unsettling language, it claimed to be from the Axeman himself. The writer mocked the police, boasting that they would never catch him. He claimed he had escaped countless traps and laughed at the efforts of detectives who were trying to identify him. Then the letter took an even stranger turn. The author declared that he was not a human being at all. Instead, he described himself as a supernatural entity, a demon sent from hell. According to the letter, he came from the hottest hell and answered to powers beyond human understanding. Whether the writer truly believed these claims or was simply trying to terrify the public remains unknown. But the most shocking part of the letter was yet to come. The Axeman announced that he would return to New Orleans on the night of Tuesday, March 19th. At precisely 15 minutes past midnight, he claimed he would once again roam the city in search of victims. Panic spread immediately. Newspapers printed the letter in full, allowing thousands of frightened citizens to read the killer's threat with their own eyes. Some people dismissed it as a hoax. Others were convinced that the Axeman was preparing for another massacre. Then came the sentence that would make the letter famous forever. The writer claimed to be a great admirer of jazz music. He promised that any house where jazz was being played at the appointed hour would be spared from his wrath. The bizarre statement stunned the city. Was it a joke? A coded message? The fantasy of a deranged murderer? Nobody knew. As the threatened night approached, fear mixed with curiosity. Residents debated whether they should believe the warning. Some families decided not to take any chances. When March 19th finally arrived, New Orleans prepared for one of the strangest nights in its history. As midnight approached, the city transformed. Jazz bands filled dance halls, bars, and theaters. Musicians who had never heard of the Axeman's letter found themselves performing for packed crowds, desperate for reassurance. The sounds of trumpets, pianos, clarinets, and drums echoed through the streets. Inside homes across the city, families gathered around phonographs and record players. Windows were left open so the music could spill into the night air. Entire neighborhoods that were usually quiet after dark suddenly pulsed with rhythm and life. Many citizens remained awake until dawn, listening nervously for signs of danger. The atmosphere was unlike anything New Orleans had ever experienced. Fear and celebration existed side by side. Some people danced to hide their anxiety. Others sat silently beside loaded weapons while jazz records spun in the background. Hour after hour passed. Midnight came and went, then 1 o'clock, then 2. As the sun finally rose over the city, residents cautiously emerged from their homes. The news spread quickly. No murders had been reported. The Axeman's promised rampage had never happened. The city erupted with relief. Some people believed the music had genuinely prevented the killer from striking. Others argued that the entire threat had been a cruel prank designed to spread panic. To this day, historians remain divided. Did the Axeman truly write the letter? Was he somewhere in the city that night, listening to the music pouring from thousands of homes? Or did New Orleans unknowingly participate in a massive act of collective defiance, refusing to surrender to fear? No one knows the answer. What is certain is that for one extraordinary night in 1919, an entire city united through jazz, turning terror into celebration and creating one of the most unforgettable chapters in American criminal history. But while the city celebrated its survival, the mystery of the Axeman was far from over.
The city had survived the infamous jazz night, but the sense of relief did not last long. For a brief moment, New Orleans believed the nightmare might be over. Residents hoped that the mysterious killer had moved on, been arrested in secret, or perhaps never intended to strike at all. The streets gradually returned to normal, and businesses reopened without the constant fear that had gripped the city for months. But the Axeman was not finished.
In the weeks that followed, reports of new attacks began to surface. Once again, families were awakened by screams in the middle of the night. Once again, investigators found evidence of forced entry and brutal axe attacks carried out while victims slept in their beds. The pattern was chillingly familiar. The killer often entered through a rear door or window after quietly removing a panel or breaking a lock. He moved through homes with remarkable stealth, avoiding detection until the moment he struck. In many cases, the weapon used in the attack belonged to the victims themselves. Axes stored in sheds, backyards, or work areas became instruments of terror. The randomness of the attacks made them even more frightening. There appeared to be no clear motive. The victims were not wealthy. Expensive items were left untouched. Jewelry, cash, and personal belongings remained exactly where they had been before the attacks. If robbery was the motive, the killer made little effort to profit from his crimes. As fear spread, rumors filled the vacuum left by the lack of answers. Some residents became convinced that no ordinary human could commit such crimes and repeatedly escape capture. Stories circulated about a phantom figure moving silently through the city at night. Witnesses described seeing shadowy silhouettes disappearing into alleyways moments after attacks occurred. The humid streets of New Orleans became fertile ground for superstition. People whispered about curses, demons, and supernatural forces. Children were warned not to wander outside after dark. Entire neighborhoods became obsessed with strange noises and unexplained sightings. Every creaking floorboard and distant footstep seemed connected to the Axeman. Meanwhile, police investigators were under enormous pressure. Detectives worked around the clock, interviewing hundreds of witnesses and examining every possible lead. They investigated known criminals, recently released prisoners, and individuals with violent histories. Anyone who behaved suspiciously suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. But every promising lead ended in disappointment. No reliable fingerprints were recovered. Witness descriptions were inconsistent and often contradictory. Some survivors described a tall attacker, while others reported a shorter figure. The darkness and chaos of the attacks made accurate identification nearly impossible. As investigators dug deeper, they noticed a curious pattern. A significant number of the victims were Italian immigrants or members of Italian-American families. Many owned small grocery stores, fruit markets, or neighborhood businesses. This discovery sparked intense speculation. Some detectives theorized that the murders were connected to organized crime. During the early 20th century, criminal organizations operated in parts of New Orleans, and violence related to extortion and business disputes was not uncommon. According to this theory, the Axeman might not have been a random killer at all. Instead, he could have been an enforcer targeting specific individuals while disguising the crimes as the work of a madman. The idea seemed plausible, yet there was a major problem. Investigators failed to uncover any solid evidence linking the victims to criminal organizations. Many of the families appeared to be ordinary, hard-working people with no known involvement in illegal activities. The theory generated headlines, but little proof. As newspapers competed for readers, coverage of the Axeman reached a fever pitch. Front-page stories detailed every rumor, every witness account, and every new development. Sensational headlines transformed the killer into a life-large figure. Some newspapers portrayed him as a criminal mind master. Others described him as a monster haunting the city. The constant publicity created a new problem. Copycat crimes began appearing across New Orleans. Whenever a burglary occurred, people blamed the Axeman. When neighbors argued violently, rumors claimed the killer was responsible. Even unrelated assaults were sometimes linked to the mysterious murderer before investigators had gathered any facts. The real Axeman, if he was still active, remained hidden behind a growing cloud of confusion. Months passed with no breakthrough.
The city was exhausted. Families continued locking their doors earlier than ever before. Weapons remained close at hand. Parents watched their children more carefully. The fear that had settled over New Orleans showed no signs of fading. And somewhere in the darkness, the person responsible for the attacks remained unidentified. The greatest mystery was still to come. Because after terrorizing an entire city and becoming one of the most feared killers in American history, the Axeman would suddenly disappear, without a confession, without an arrest, and without leaving behind a single answer.
By the second half of 1919, New Orleans was growing impatient. For more than a year, the city had lived under the shadow of the Axeman. Families slept in fear, businesses suffered, and newspapers printed endless headlines about the mysterious killer. Yet despite the enormous public attention, the police had little to show for their efforts. Public confidence in law enforcement began to collapse. Citizens openly criticized the police department in newspapers, community meetings, and conversations throughout the city. Many could not understand how a murderer could repeatedly enter occupied homes, attack victims, and escape without being identified. The criticism became especially harsh because of the unusual nature of the crimes. The Axeman rarely brought his own weapon. Instead, he often used axes or tools that already belonged to the victims. In several cases, he appeared to enter homes through doors or windows without causing major damage. This suggested planning, patience, and a familiarity with his surroundings. To many residents, it seemed impossible that such a criminal could remain free. Editorials accused investigators of incompetence. Rumors spread that the police were hiding information from the public. Some citizens even formed their own patrol groups, convinced that ordinary people stood a better chance of catching the killer than trained detectives. Behind the scenes, investigators were equally frustrated. Every promising suspect eventually led nowhere. Witness descriptions remained inconsistent, and physical evidence was scarce. Detectives found themselves trapped in a maze of theories, rumors, and dead ends. As the months passed, the attacks became less frequent, but fear remained. Then came what would become the final chapter of the Axeman's known reign of terror. On October 27, 1919, tragedy struck once again. A young Italian-American grocer named Mike Pepitone was asleep in his home when an intruder entered during the night. According to reports, the attacker struck Pepitone with a blunt object, inflicting devastating injuries. The assault followed many of the same patterns associated with the Axeman. It occurred under cover of darkness. The victim was attacked inside his own home. Once again, there appeared to be little motive beyond the act of violence itself. Pepitone died from his injuries. The murder shocked New Orleans. Residents feared it was merely the beginning of another wave of attacks. Newspapers warned readers to remain vigilant, and police intensified their investigations. But something strange happened. Days passed, then weeks, then months. No new attacks occurred. The killer who had terrorized an entire city simply disappeared as mysteriously as he had arrived. Investigators waited for another attack, convinced it was only a matter of time. None came. As years passed, the case gradually transformed from an active investigation into an unsolved mystery. Theories multiplied. Some believed the killer had died. Others suspected he was imprisoned for an unrelated crime. A few argued that the Axeman had moved to another city and continued killing under a different identity. Without an arrest or confession, every theory remained speculation. The mystery took another unexpected turn years later. Mike Pepitone's widow eventually moved to Los Angeles. According to later accounts, she became convinced that she had discovered the identity of her husband's killer. She claimed the murderer was a man named Joseph Momfrey. Her story was dramatic. According to her account, Momfrey had been involved with criminal activities and had connections that could explain some of the violence associated with the Axeman case.
She believed he was responsible for her husband's murder and possibly for other attacks as well. The claim attracted attention because it offered something investigators had never possessed, a specific suspect. However, there was a problem. No evidence conclusively supported her accusation. Police were unable to verify her story, and historians later found significant gaps in the account. While Joseph Momfrey remains one of the most frequently mentioned names connected to the Axeman mystery, no definitive proof has ever linked him to the crimes. As a result, the theory remains exactly that, a theory. The truth is that after years of investigation, countless interviews, and endless speculation, no one could say with certainty who the Axeman really was. The killer who had stalked New Orleans, terrified thousands of people, inspired legendary headlines, and filled the city with fear, had slipped away into history. And with every passing decade, the mystery only grew deeper. Because the final question remained: who was the Axeman of New Orleans?
More than a century has passed since the Axeman vanished into history, yet the mystery remains as fascinating as ever. Unlike many famous criminals whose identities were eventually uncovered, the Axeman left behind almost nothing that could conclusively reveal who he was. No confession was ever verified. No suspect was ever charged. No piece of evidence ever connected a single individual to all of the attacks. As a result, historians and true crime researchers continue to debate one of the most important questions surrounding the case. Was the Axeman actually one person? Some experts believe a single killer was responsible for the attacks. They point to the similarities between the crimes, the nighttime home invasions, the use of axes found at the victims' residences, the attacks on sleeping occupants, and the apparent lack of robbery as a motive. To these researchers, the pattern suggests a lone predator who operated for a brief period before disappearing forever. Others disagree. They argue that the crimes may have been committed by several different individuals. According to this theory, once newspapers began linking violent attacks together under the name the Axeman, unrelated crimes may have been grouped into a single narrative. This possibility becomes more believable when considering the chaos of the era. New Orleans in the early 20th century was a bustling port city filled with immigrants, laborers, merchants, and organized crime activity. Police departments lacked the resources and investigative tools available today. Communication between agencies was limited, record-keeping was inconsistent, and criminal profiling did not yet exist. In such an environment, it would have been easy for separate crimes to be connected simply because they appeared similar. The famous letter supposedly written by the Axeman never deepened the confusion. Some historians believe the letter was genuinely authored by the killer. Others suspect it was written by a journalist seeking publicity, a prankster hoping to frighten the city, or someone completely unrelated to the murders. Because the author was never identified, the letter remains one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. What is beyond dispute, however, is the impact the Axeman had on New Orleans. Few criminals have become so deeply intertwined with the identity of a city. The story of the Axeman gradually evolved beyond newspaper headlines and police reports. It became part of local folklore, a dark legend passed from one generation to the next. Writers turned the mystery into novels and historical studies. Musicians referenced the strange tale of the killer who supposedly loved jazz. Filmmakers and television producers found inspiration in the eerie combination of violence, mystery, and supernatural rumors that surrounded the case. Over time, the Axeman transformed from a real criminal into something larger. He became a symbol of New Orleans' mysterious past. The image of a shadowy figure stalking the city's narrow streets while jazz music echoed from homes and dance halls proved impossible to forget. Few true crime stories possess such unusual and haunting imagery. The case is also a reminder of how different criminal investigations were in the early 20th century. Today, detectives have access to DNA analysis, digital databases, surveillance cameras, forensic psychology, and advanced fingerprint technology. A modern serial killer leaves behind countless traces that investigators can analyze. In 1918, those tools simply did not exist.
Crime scenes were often contaminated by curious neighbors, reporters, and even police officers. Evidence collection procedures were inconsistent. Witness statements were frequently unreliable. Many investigative techniques that are considered standard today had not yet been developed. As a result, the Axeman left behind no trail that modern science could follow. No preserved DNA evidence exists that could identify him. No verified fingerprints connect him to the crimes. No surviving piece of forensic evidence has provided the breakthrough researchers have long hoped for. The passage of time has only made the mystery more difficult to solve. Many records have been lost, witnesses are long gone, and physical evidence has disappeared. With every passing year, the chances of discovering the truth grow smaller. Yet the Axeman of New Orleans remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. No one knows who he was. No one knows why he chose his victims. No one knows whether he died, escaped, or simply stopped killing. What remains is the image of a frightened city listening to jazz in the middle of the night, hoping music could keep death away. And somewhere in the shadows of history, the identity of the Axeman remains hidden forever. A ghost of New Orleans, leaving behind nothing but fear, legend, and questions that may never be answered. And with this, our story ends. If you like the story, then like it and subscribe to hear more such stories.